taken here. Floor is yours, Duncan.
Good to go here. I obviously want to ditto and support everything that Peter's been doing with the adaptive sports program. I know many of the professionals today have mentioned their disclosures, so I think it's appropriate that I share with you my disclosures, and that is that I'm college educated. I have a undergrad and graduate degree. I've had multiple jobs and careers, never unemployed in my adult life. I'm disgustingly debt-free, middle-class lifestyle. But perhaps the most important disclosure is that I'm very well connected with a rich network of clinicians and researchers. And this dates back to 1980 when I joined the national staff of United Cerebral Palsy. And in that office in New York City was one Murray Goldstein, who kind of took me under his wing for the 4 years I was there. And then, of course, because of Murray, I've met Nigel and Ed Hurwitz and a whole slew of very important people. And I recognize that those attributes or those connections that I have put me in a very small sliver of the 800,000 people in America that have cerebral palsy. So that gives me a certain bias in how I approach life. Why the title Beyond the Expiration Date? In 1947, a year after my birth, my parents took me to a clinic in Detroit where I was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. They now had a label, a term, a diagnosis. But that diagnosis also was accompanied with a prognosis. And the prognosis was, your son will never walk, your son will have very limited intellectual abilities, and he will probably be dead by age 40. Our recommendation is to put him in an institution and go have another baby. My parents accepted the diagnosis and they rejected the prognosis with the exception of have another baby, my younger sister. So why is it that nearly 40 years after the time when I should have died, am I still alive and well and having a great time of it? And I would say that the first reason is for this extended shelf life that I have, is I had the foresight to choose my parents well. And I want this opportunity because today we've talked a lot about diagnostics and treatments and interventions and research. And all of those have been important in my life, but the most critical factor in my life was, in fact, my parents, who were my first advocates. They were the ones who fought to have me in my neighborhood school at a time when segregation was the educational rule of the day. And more importantly, they not only allowed, but they always encouraged, actively encouraged me to explore activities that were outside of my comfort zone, to try new things, new environments, new social engagement and all. And those were, for me, the building blocks um, of informed choice later in life. And those were the building blocks that on which my self-advocacy and advocacy life is really built. So I just want to say how critical parents are, that we professionals and we consumers need to make sure that parents are a integral part of all of our activities. They never once do I recall that they lowered any expectations for me as their son simply because I happen to have a disability. In fact, my father came to Michigan State in the 30s and played varsity hockey at the old Dem Hall. And but I never remember my dad ever verbally or through his actions ever express any disappointment in me as his son having a disability. In fact, just the opposite. As I said, he actively taught me sports skills, recreational skills that have transferred to my daily living and certainly had a major impact on my health and wellness in my adult years. I mentioned that I pursued multiple career paths, but once again, that goes way back to my parents allowing me, actively encouraging me to do things outside of my comfort zone. And it was because of that I, when I came out of Michigan State, I taught junior, senior high school for 8 years. And when I made the decision to go into the independent living movement for disability, many people, Duncan, you made it in the non-disabled world. Why take that chance? But once again, I was taught to never be risk adversive. And I think Peter talked about how important sport is, I think, and engagement in community recreation, because it does allow us to develop those skills where we take a risk, where we try new approaches to life. I also want to talk about, I think all of us, parents, professionals, peers, really need to encourage young people with disabilities and adults with disabilities to become volunteers. I look way back to the late 70s when I first became involved with United Cerebral Palsy. And it was very rare that I saw somebody else with cerebral palsy in a volunteer role with UCP. And I think that's true even today, that we who have disabilities, particularly visible physical disabilities, tend to be the recipients of volunteer services rather than the provider of volunteer services. And so when we can explore opportunities for persons with disabilities to become volunteers themselves, to have mentorship opportunities and to take their personal life experience into their volunteer roles, I think that has dividends for everyone in all situations. I also would emphasize that for me personally, lifelong learning, and once again, I go back to my parents who, my father came out of Michigan State with a bachelor's degree in ROTC training. And a year after he entered the job market, he was called up for something called World War II and spent the next 4 years in North Africa and the European theater. But my father was, and he came back, he pursued a master's degree and eventually a doctorate. He was very involved and he was one of the first presidents of the UCP affiliate. He was very active in Kiwanis, and he modeled for me a volunteer lifestyle. And I think as I look back on my life, some of my most rewarding experiences have been as a volunteer, being able to give rather than to receive or take. So I really encourage all of us to be constantly exploring opportunities for individuals with disabilities to be providers as well as recipients. And certainly part of that lifelong learning and volunteer ethic for me has been my current involvement with the Cerebral Palsy Research Network, because I'm constantly learning about my own characteristic as cerebral palsy, and hopefully contributing back. I truly believe that all of us have to be committed to continuous personal growth. For me, the bottom line is when you stop growing, you start dying. And I'm not ready to die. So, but all that said, now at the age of 76, I'm going to coin a term for you today. It's called pioneer fatigue. And my pioneer fatigue goes back to the 70s when I was the first or the only kid with a visible disability in my neighborhood school, or in scouting, or in 4-H, or the first kid with a visible disability that had ever put on skis at Mount Marquette. And once again, my good fortune was that the teaching pro at Mount Marquette thought, wow, this is incredible. A kid with disability, I can teach him to ski. And sure enough, I learned how. And then I also found that it wasn't just grade school, middle school, and high school. Even when I got to Michigan State in the mid-60s, yes, there were other students, few and far between, on campus who had visible disabilities, but in any given curriculum classroom, I was quite often the first, which was a challenge for the instructors and a challenge for me, because so many of these experiences existed, took place before federal legislation on education inclusion, before barrier-free design statutes and regulations, and certainly before the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then when I came out of college and went into the workforce, once again, I tended to see myself as a pioneer, because most often I would be the first that had been hired into that workplace who had a visible physical disability. And that is carried over to volunteer organizations. Once again, so many volunteer organizations see those of us with disabilities as the recipient of their volunteer services, not as part of those volunteer services. And now in my 70s, I find myself as a pioneer again, because certainly in my age cohort, there's a growing percentage of people who have some type of disability characteristic, a decline in their hearing, or a vision issue, or a mobility issue. But overwhelmingly, they are individuals in senior adult programs and services who spend a lot of time talking about, well, before I got old, you know, before I couldn't hear so well, or, you know, they have a really hard time defining themselves as having a disability. They simply have a changing way of doing things. And that carries over into the healthcare arena. Earlier today, I think, Ed, you talked about Mary Gennady. Mary has sent us an email today of an article out of the New York Times talking about how many doctors really don't want to have patients who have disabilities. So I'm sure I'm going to enjoy reading that article. And my primary care providers up here in the Upper Peninsula, boy, do I miss Lansing and Ann Arbor. They're good people, they care, but you know, when they have really no background or training that is disability specific, let alone cerebral palsy. So next week I'm on a teleconference with Michael Andery, who is my PMR doctor of choice at Michigan State, because I need to talk with someone about the intersection of my cerebral palsy and my aging process. And by and large, I have a very difficult time finding healthcare professionals up here who have any understanding at intersection of disability and aging, and simply would rather not deal with it. They're uncomfortable with it. So once again, I'm back to how much I value my involvement with the CPE Research Network. Kind of a personal, I talked about Murray Goldstein's early influence on me in the 80s. And it was at a conference, I think in Arlington, Virginia, that this, at the time, a younger Dr. Ed Hurwitz introduced me to something called the New Step, which was a piece of equipment that had just been developed down there near Ann Arbor. And even back then in the 90s, Ed understood the value of exercise in terms of all those issues that Peter talked about. So I thank Madeline and Nigel. I am so disappointed in your retirement, but I'll be more than happy to mentor you about how to move into retirement. You know, I do want everyone in the audience to know, you may not, it was 18 months ago that Nigel was an incredible advocate on the national level and really hammered away at the Washington bureaucracy to say, you know, COVID vaccinations, COVID care, you need to include people with developmental disabilities. And so, Nigel, I thank you on behalf of that community because I know you moved the needle here in Michigan with the Department of Public Health in terms of their responses to this population. So those are my thoughts and comments. I'm very shy in retiring, so